Voices family. Welcome to episodes 9 and 10. These next two episodes are actually filmed in one. They were one long 2-hour conversation that I had with my friends and colleagues. These women are faculty at St. Mary's College of California in the single subject teacher education program, and they have been working a lot on trying to do the work of humanizing education, and I really have a lot of admiration for both of them, Raina and Mary Raygoza. So we sit down and we talk about what I'm calling not like back to school, but more like reimagine school, right? So it's this idea that we can't go into our schools with the same concepts that we had before, because too much has happened. Like, we've lost too many people. We've lost nearly 200,000 people. Can you imagine that? Nearly 200,000 people have died since school ended last semester. We also have had this situation where we have a pandemic of, anti-blackness, and that pandemic has caused the death and harm to black folks, and a movement for Black lives. So I'm actually wearing this "I Can't Breathe" t-shirt, but one of the things that I'm very happy and proud of is that I figured out how to breathe over the course of this summer, and part of my breathing is my recognition that as long as I have breath in my body, I can make a contribution to the movement for Black lives. And so that's what this episode is. That's what this podcast does. And so we really, really appreciate you for listening, for learning, and for amplifying. Join our movement. Check us out, unhiddenvoices.org. And let's keep learning and growing and breathing together. Okay, now I can hear you.
Oh, you can? Okay, good.
Yes. Okay.
What do you do?
I think I had my phone on silent, which is probably not a good thing when I'm trying to hear. But yeah,
That's a very good thing.
I clicked the volume and it turned on. Okay, I can take these off now. All right. All righty. Okay, so yay, we're here.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so today's conversation is going to help us with our piece for the on teacher education. And so basically what I've been trying to do with these is just, have a conversation that a lot of it has to do with identity and sort of like how our identities inform our experience of this particular moment, right? But then also our work, right? So when it comes to sort of like the questions that, or the frameworks for the article, my thinking is more around that, like teacher work, teacher identity. But I'm, very open to your thoughts and your input on that. I have a set of questions, that, to start us with, and we can build on those to continue and see what's going to make the most sense to flesh this out. But
and I think that the article, or the collection of articles that the call is actually perfect for us. That intersection of teacher leadership, on identity, on healing is where we all live. So
yes.
That's right.
Yeah. So Mary, what do you think?
I think that sounds great. Can I ask what your questions are to have a sense of?
Yeah. So what
where we go?
Do is put them in the let me pull them up. I'm gonna put the link to them in the chat.
As you're putting the link in, I just have to note that my daughter is right in front of me, and she often does this thing, which is probably something that I do. I don't realize that I do it, but anyway, it's the pointing finger, which is like, what you not gonna do, what you are gonna do.
Okay. Oh, that's
like, I don't know what I'm not gonna do and what I am gonna do, but it's clear that she has insight into those things.
That is so cool. Okay, so yeah,
Right
those
out of the
are
womb.
the questions I just added to the chat. Yeah, so let's, I want to give you a second to kind of look through them and, okay. So should we get started, or do you have any suggestions for thoughts? All right. All right, well, away we go. Okay, so, all right, so let's just, typically what's going to happen is I'm going to do just a, voiceover, and thank you for sharing your photos. The first question I have is just for you to tell us your name and tell us a little bit about your bio, like tell us about yourselves. And so, why don't we start with Mary, and then Mary, toss it to Raina.
Sorry, just finding my unmute. So I'm Mary Raygoza. I'm an assistant professor of teacher education at St. Mary's College, working alongside you all. So thank you so much, Amina, for having us here in this space. It's really an honor to be invited to be on the podcast, but also just another opportunity to get to be in dialogue with you both. So thank you. Thank you for this, and thank you, for the important work that you're up to here. I guess a little bit about my background. So I grew up in Concord, here in the East Bay area, in a white working class, moving up to middle class family. I went to public schools in the Concord area, and I did my undergrad at Cal and went down to UCLA for my teacher ed and doctoral work. I was a high school teacher down there, and I'm just really driven in my work as a teacher educator by commitments to equity and social justice, and really understanding how I can interrogate, my own privilege and work alongside other folks to do that work, and really try to bring who we are and why we're called to the work to the forefront, and everything that we do.
And you're also a mom and right? A mom. What do you have a name for it? Like a mother academics, what is it called?
Oh yeah, I know some folks will say, mother scholar, mama scholar. I'm a tired mom bee. I think really sums it up the best maybe right now, to be frank. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a newly turned 3-year-old daughter, Rose Esperanza, who's the light of my life, and teaches me so much. And I became a mom 5 days before I became a teacher educator in this position here at St. Mary's. She was born June 26th, and I started, on July 1st, 3 years ago. And I experienced a lot of synergy in motherhood and in doing this work. Just really thinking about like what it means to be with my child, to meet her basic human needs of joy and wonder and curiosity and hope and connection and all of these things. And like those are all of the things, right, that I think about in my work as a teacher educator as well. Yeah. So such an important part of my identity. And I should say too, I'm also married to a principal. Yeah. So our education, our household is a educator's household, and we're just kind of talking all the time about what's up, right now, both in K through 12 and in the higher ed landscape, and it's quite a time.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you. And thank you for sharing, Mary. And Raina,
yes,
I'd love to hear more about you.
So when the podcast comes, folks won't see me holding a baby, but that's what I'm doing. So my name is Dr. Raina Leon, and I am originally from Philadelphia, lived in Lisjan Ohlone territory for, 5 years now, but I've been in and well, actually, no. I've been in Berkeley for the 5 years, but in Ohlone territory for 9 years as a teacher educator. I am a full professor of education, only the third Black person at St. Mary's College in 157 years, if I remember correctly, of history to achieve that rank, and the first Afro-Latina that I can find in any kind of record. In addition to being a teacher educator, I'm a poet and writer and writing coach. And so I should share. Wow, okay. Arelia, my daughter, has a lot to contributions. So I founded the Acentus Review, which has published over 800 Latinx voices in our 12-year history. I'm also an editor for Raising Mothers, which focuses on femme and non-binary mothers of color, parents of color, and our stories. So I'm the poetry editor for them. So doing a lot of things. How, I'm originally from Philadelphia. And folks should know that just because I'm from the North doesn't mean that I don't understand segregation in schools from a very lived experience. And I think that that's something that often isn't talked about as far as like schooling experiences within geographically northern cities, of like the limitations of and the impact of redlining and housing practices and segregation on schooling experiences. So thinking about that was a commonality with my experience as well as with my mother's experience, and she is from rural Pennsylvania. How long have I been doing this job as a teacher educator? Goodness, 9 years. Yes. And this is the longest I've actually ever had one job or lived in one location other than growing up in Philadelphia. So definitely when I was emerging into adulthood, 3 years was the limit of me staying in a place. Never thought I would be here for 9, but here I am. And so I was the director of our program for a bit. I was for a year, went away, came back, and then I'm now coming into teacher education department chair in January. So I'm super excited about that. And your question, how are you and the family? We're doing okay. You know, it's pandemic time. It's stressful.
Yeah.
And I've got a punk rock toddler and a newborn. So who's smiling so beautifully right now.
So I do want to say that people will see you and you're feeding the baby, because this is going to air not only as an audio podcast, but also a video podcast on YouTube.
Ooh.
Well, in that case, I just want to make a plug for the merch of Unhidden Voices. I got my shirt.
Yeah.
It's super comfy. It's super stylish. And I can't wait till I'm out in the world again and people ask me, where'd you get that shirt? Because I know it's going to happen.
That's
awesome.
Yay. Yeah, actually, I'm wearing 6 feet, please. And even though I'm in the house, you know, I'm like, yeah, everybody, we need to just remind ourselves of the importance of like socially distancing, wearing our masks, doing those things to save our lives and each other's.
And I'm wearing my Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority incorporated
because
we're having a really good day.
Kamala Harris is
the VP. That's
VP.
right.
Yeah. Yes. That's amazing. So yeah, there's a lot going on, and and you talked a little bit about how you're doing, Raina. I want to give you a chance to kind of speak more in depth about that, and then have Mary share how she's doing, and then and I'll talk a little bit about how I'm doing, and then we go on to the next question. So so yeah, it's pandemic time, but what is that actually been like for you and your family?
It has definitely been, we are all in the space of stress, right? In isolation, and also seeing the numbers climb, and their impact, especially on Black and Brown communities. And like, I have an aunt, as I've mentioned to you all before, who had COVID, was at the point of incredible fatigue, had a toe amputated, like, so, and part of that due to complications, I believe, with COVID. Another cousin in the hospital, an aunt who was another aunt who was impacted by COVID. Like, it's running through. And I know I'm not the only person who has also lost people through COVID. So there is this tension between grief and horror at governmental dysfunction, and concern for family near and far. My husband's is Italian, so when they were going into quarantine, we were watching very carefully. And at the same time, giving birth in a pandemic, not for the faint of heart, especially when under suspicion of having COVID, and giving birth in an isolation room and not being able to leave, and fighting just to be fed, all those things in the hospital. And then not being able to get follow-up care very easily, to birth traumatic extending trauma effect, for ongoing things that have not been resolved and are hard to get resolved when no one will see you. So there's that. And at the same time, the bliss, right, of being home and all the time, and witnessing punk rock toddler emerge in his true, like, anarchistic, screaming, power pounding, drumming self, right? And very distinct in his opinions, and being like, this world does not have much space for Black boys being full and wonderful and giving, if you will pardon me, no shits. Like, just doing, whatever it is that arises that fills them with wonder, right? There's not much space for that. And so being able to foster that in this time is incredibly beautiful. So there's that. And, I got this little baby who goes with me to Black feminist meditation courses. Like,
well, hold her up, because we can only see, like, her.
I know. There she is.
There she is.
Baby. And that's right. That's
How old is she?
She is going to be 12 weeks on Saturday.
Yay.
Yes.
She's so beautiful.
Yes, and her little onesie was made by, instead of doing a baby shower because pandemic, we did, our neighbor shut down the street. They were actually decorating it. So it's a yearly tradition, and this year we actually appeared in the paper for the decorations that folks were doing. But we put out a table with a whole bunch of onesies, and our neighbors decorated them. So she's got all these different ones. And I love that one of the kids said, silly and wonderful, F.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I love that.
Okay. Oh. So Mary, how are you? How are you doing and your family?
Yeah, Amina, thank you so much for asking that question, right? Like, I feel like part of how I'm doing is just like the sense of rage at business as usual, and being in spaces where we're not checking in on one another, and just recognizing our own humanity and experience and what's happening right now, so thank you. I think, I connect a lot to what you just shared, Raina. I mean, in experiencing grief and horror, and like, I know Raina, you have lost some family, and Amina, I think it was your cousin who just passed. I'm so sorry. I also just had a family friend pass, Adriana Espino, who was in my life since I was 7 months old, and was just a dear person to me and my family. And it's just like the kind of individual personal grief, and then the collective grief and trauma, I think is just, it's a lot to hold, right? And then I recognize too how just in a lot of ways, I don't experience, right? We're inequitably impacted, right? And so in a lot of my privileged identities, I don't experience that in the same way, right? And so my grief in that way is not the most important to center, right? I think that through it all, like just getting to be a part of spaces like this, reading Bettina Love's next piece, that comes out, reading about that, hearing about the Abolitionist Teaching Network, going to all amazing webinars of educators everywhere about how we can radically dream differently about the world and the kind of school systems we have, like that in this time is just giving me a lot of hope. So I'm really hope filled. And I have a lot of optimism for doing what we do really differently. So I just, I feel like in this time, there's just like so much about right now is uncertain, like unpredictable is like just the word that we hear everywhere. Things are unpredictable, but I just also feel like this sense of certainty and moral clarity, and a lot of folks really coming together around what we're certain about. And that sustains me in some really important ways.
You said something that I'd like you to talk a little bit more in depth about not centering your grief because of the difference in privilege. And so, can you speak more about that and explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, sure.
That actually, how does that actually come out in terms of how you address and deal with grief?
Yeah, I mean, like just thinking about the movement for Black lives, the uprising for Black lives, and the societal trauma and racial violence that's impacted, Black folks, everywhere. And for you all as my colleagues, I just I feel a lot of anger around that, right? A lot of dissatisfaction, a lot of, this cannot continue, and I want to do something about it, right? But I also recognize, and I'm thinking about the piece that you wrote, Amina, about, what it means to be an ally or be a co-conspirator, and really also just step back and make space for the experiences of people of color, Black people who are experiencing what's going on firsthand, and trying to do my learning about calls to action of what to do, from you, and so, yeah, so that's what I kind of mean there, right? Like, how can I just make some space and learn, and not feel like I decide myself what to do.
Yeah,
that's not what matters.
Yeah. Thank you both for sharing, and also thank you for acknowledging just the grief that we're all experiencing, and ways in which we need to center experiences, because we do experience this differently, right? And so what part of what I'm trying to do now is really connect with and collaborate with folks around, Babala Kwanele, who is she is a dear friend of mine, and she and we launched, like, the first episodes were really, she and I in dialogue with each other. But one of the things that we've been talking about too is sort of like, she coined this phrase this morning where she said, grief doesn't have a time clock. Trauma doesn't have a time clock. So things are just like they maybe sort of I got this Apple Watch. This is an aside, but I got this Apple Watch, right? And I was like, this way, I'll have something to tell me to get up and move or whatever, because otherwise I'll just be in this house and I won't be like, there's lots of snacks in here. And I need to kind of, but then I tell my husband, like, I ordered it and it was downstairs, and he comes upstairs and he's like, you ordered a watch? And I was like, yeah, my phone is too heavy. So I needed to get an Apple Watch. But now it's like everything rings, right? Like my arm is ringing, my phone is ringing. Yeah, okay. That's an aside. Probably not the best idea for a podcast.
What is the authentic sounds of life?
100%. 100%. I don't know even know how to silence this thing. Okay. No, I don't. I'm gonna call you back. Okay, sorry. Okay, yeah, so that's the thing, right? And certain things that are happening are triggering other things that, maybe suppress memories. And I think for me, a lot of what has, like I woke up and it's August, right? And I'm like, whoa, you know what I'm saying? We're about to go back into full on teaching. And all of these things have happened. And my fury, I would say, has really forced me into a sense of urgency, particularly around the fact that I'm very much aware that our lives are in danger, and mine is in danger, and people that I love lives are in danger, and people are dying, right? And so, this is we're in a temporal space, right? So as a result of that, it's like, what is the contribution that we can make in this time that's very limited, that can actually provide some source of healing, some source of support, some sorts of forward motion, right? That can also be a benefit. Because even like today, so I called my mom just to check in, and she's like, are you sitting down? And like, we lost somebody else today. Like, I found out that my mom's like she was my babysitter, Kathy, when we lived in the Fillmore, and she was our neighbor when we lived on Ellis Street, and we used to say we lived across the street from the ghetto because we were like little kids, and we literally lived across the street from affordable housing. So in our mind, we're like, we live across the street from the ghetto, even though we lived in the ghetto, but we didn't know that, right? And we actually were living in probably affordable housing too, because my mom was a single mom, but we were like 5, 6, 7 years old. So and Kathy was our neighbor, and she died of lung cancer. So it's just the situation where, life is very fleeting, and it goes really fast. And so the things that we can do in terms of the contribution and the work, I think is really important. And so that's one of the reasons why I really, really value this opportunity to have this conversation with you and to learn from you about your experiences as well. So with that being said, and I'm changing this question because I feel like, particularly for people of color, racism doesn't just inform our work, right? Because it's absolutely very much intertwined to everything that we, like, our everyday existence in this society. So how does racism inform your life? Like, how is it informing you, like, in what you're doing and your thinking, right? And your work through that process, I guess, of addressing it or dealing with it. So Raina, we'll start with you, and then Mary.
I am very aware of racism all the time. As a teacher educator, as a professor, as a person walking in the world, I'm also very aware of the toxicity that can invade my body and the bodies of Black and Brown peoples, folks who experience racism viscerally, how that impacts us and changes our very makeup through generational trauma, right? And so while I am aware and thoughtful and act as much as I can in ways of resistance and in holding space for the telling of our stories and pushing back against erasure, I am also in a space of constantly saying, this is real. This is the real thing. How can we undermine that? And how can we also be free and joyous? And how can we write that on our, and I speak again as someone who is Black, who is Latina, of like, how can I make sure that I am not perpetuating white supremacy and also internalizing racism. We all have our internalized racism. Like, I'm not saying that we don't, right? Or that I don't. But trying to challenge, interrogate, push back against that for the sake of me and the sake of my kids and my communities of which I am a part. And they are varied and marvelous and amazing and conflicted too. And thinking about like holding that space for freedom, because freedom was complex and it is also joyous. And I'm not just I want to also be in the space of visioning for transformation rather than always living in the pain of today. If that makes sense.
Sorry. So yeah, so I think in our history of as Black people in this country, that when we initially conceived of freedom, we thought of it as like a goal that we would achieve like from slavery, right? So we become free and then things are just going to be different for us. And now I think it's almost like it's like a continual journey, and there's moments that we might experience of true freedom, true like that joyous thing that you mentioned, that kind of transcendence and transformation, but then we have to keep going to keep that happening and to become free. Like we're never free, right? But we are in the act of becoming free, you know.
Yeah, my mom, so you know, I work in partnership with my mom with Story Joy, and it's very centered on stories and fostering that joyousness in the journey, right? And she tells this story about where she's from in Western Pennsylvania. There's a church called John Wesley Church. I think it's an AME Zion church. But my apologies to the parishioners if I've totally messed up the name, but John Wesley for sure. And at that site, it's actually at the site of a tunnel that was part of the Underground Railroad. And they used to have a bell at the top of the tower. They eventually took it down and preserved it. But that bell was rung every time someone who had been previously enslaved, right? A free person whose movement and labor and all these things and life and children were taken away, were stolen away. But every time that they reach freedom, every time that they reach the ability to make those decisions for themselves as the full human beings that they were, that bell was rung. And I think about that like as what you're talking about, that journey. The bell was rung when someone got someplace, but the bell has to keep ringing, right? Because we're always getting to another point of right. Evolution, of journey, of liberation.
That's right. That's right. Maybe that's what we need to call this paper. Ring that bell. Something.
I love it.
With baby coos and singing all in the midst of it so beautifully.
But don't put the bell a sound on the Apple Watch. Like that's
right. So Mary, so what's your answer to that question about addressing racism in your experiencing it in your work and in your life?
Yeah, I mean, well, you know, as as a youngster, of course, and, you know, to this day, I have the privilege of walking the world, and not having to think about race, right, and racism. I think for me, you know, when I was growing up, you know, thinking back to Raina's speaking about, you know, going to segregated schools, you know, I did here in the Bay Area, right? And there's this sense about the Bay being like super like progressive and like, you know, like over racism and all that stuff, you know, amongst white people, of course, right? You know, and that I definitely think that, you know, that narrative and like the like celebrate diversity narrative was one that, you know, sort of shaped my life as a young student, and as a, you know, a person in my family. You know, when I was in elementary school, we did, what's it like when we had like the kindergartners or the kindergartners, we dressed up as, which way was it? Yeah, the kindergartners dressed up as Indians, right, as indigenous people. And the fifth graders dressed up as pilgrims, and we had this like really, in fourth grade we did the mission project, right? Like we never talked about, you know, race and racism and history. I mean, we just, you know, like it was just a mess, right? It was a mess, and it was all taken as normal, and this is what it is. I think, you know, when I got to middle school, so the elementary school I lived in, the neighborhood was mostly like white, working middle class, and the middle school I went to drew the school, you know, boundaries came from both sides of the BART tracks. And on the other side of the BART tracks is what's like referred to as the Monument Corridor. So it was more community, you know, it's community of color, many more immigrant families moving in during the time I was coming into middle school. And so what was happening at that time was white families who lived on my side of the BART tracks were fleeing the school, right? Sometimes the neighborhood, but definitely fleeing the school. So this white flight was happening. And I remember like being in the living room and my parents having these conversations of like, you know, should we send her there, right? Like I didn't have any way of making sense of what that was about, right? My framework was like, well, my friends are also going there. Like, why would I not go to school, you know, at Oak Grove? And, you know, and I did go to Oak Grove, and, you know, I think that going to school there was really like an eye-opening experience for me, and it really informs my work a lot today in many ways, because it was so blatant, just like the dehumanizing practices, just the way school was set up, and directly like from teachers and admin, you know, toward my classmates of color, right? Like I have vivid memories of like being in class, and like we're in rows in my English class, and the teacher's like going through one person at a time, like saying people's grades out loud to the whole class, and just like, you know, clearly like the students of color, especially like the, you know, Latino boys in the class would have like the lowest grades, and it was just like, you know, it was like humiliating, right? And coming back to the point I made earlier, like, you know, I felt sick to my stomach about it going on, and I was like the white girl in class getting the, you know, being announced with the A, right? And, you know, so I think that was, you know, that moment in my schooling definitely kind of lit a fire inside me, and, you know, made me want to actually went to a high school it was on the same road as the high school I was supposed to go to in my neighborhood, but it was on Oak Grove Road, but the name changes to Castle Rock Road, and it's like the high school that's in like the wealthy part of the district. And it was like eye-opening, just like the differences in resources and everything that we had there, and like just, you know, how underprepared I was to engage in the curriculum. Like, not saying that the curriculum at the high school was like, you know, good or what it should be, right? But centered around like the high stakes standardized test prep type stuff. You know, and when I was the high school senior, I went back to my middle school to we do like high school senior project, and I wanted to do mine on educational inequality because I was kind of curious about this stuff. And when I went back to my middle school, I wanted to talk to my teachers to kind of learn more about, you know, what was going on with the school. And there was only one teacher there who taught when I was there, right? That was 4 years later, and there was one teacher. She was my 8th grade English teacher. And she told me, and this is right when No Child Left Behind happened. And she told me, I have scripted curriculum. I can't teach my autobiography project anymore. I can't teach my poetry project anymore. And she had tears in her eyes, right? And that was a moment for me that was like, we can't do education like this. And like, this is clearly harmful, for communities of color, to just think that like these top down high stakes approaches is what needs to happen. So, yeah, so I think that that's, I went on a long story there. I'm sorry about that. But, I think I really come back to that because like now I'm a teacher educator here at St. Mary's, and I get to work with teachers at Oak Grove Middle School, and, and I'm hoping to work more with the school. But we got a lot of work to do. And I think, my own complicitness in the process of racism being perpetuated through education, and then like, ways I can be on the path to intervening. But I want to give a shout out to Dr. Erica O. Turner, who just came out with I want to get the name right, a guide for equity in pandemic schooling, an action guide that I've been trying to share, amplify everywhere. And we just read it in the foundations class with our teacher ed students right now. But it's a really helpful framework for really thinking about intersecting systems of oppression, and then like how does that translate for what we do, as individual families.
I think that is a good segue to our next question, which is really like, how does racism impact your family? So why don't we have you, Mary, answer that, and then we'll go to Raina and then come back.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we experience a lot of privilege, right? I think that like, my parents moving through their jobs, my dad as a college professor as well, myself, now in my work as a teacher educator, right? I think that, we all benefit from the effects of not, being questioned, like when we talk about things like inequality and racism, we're given like pats on the backs and stuff like that, so yeah, I mean, and in some very real ways, we benefit from the privilege, and also, are in this position where we don't even see those benefits all the time, and so trying to work to see them, I think, is it's the lifelong journey.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Mary. Raina, how does racism impact your family?
So I start from my subjectivity. So when racism, of course, influences so many parts of our lives, and when it most negatively impacts me in academia, that filters into how I interact with my family, right? It filters into how I function as a mother, as a partner, as a community member, and so on. And then I think on my mother, for example, living in a very racially divided and contentious community in rural Western Pennsylvania, very small town where my family has been for over 200 years, and actually moved there because of racism. Was the family story is that they moved in the 1800s from Virginia because they were a mixed family, and that there were folks who were free Black people, and then there were folks who were white folks who had, very intermingled family. And then when Virginia put into place a law that said, okay, it doesn't matter if you're free or not, after this law, you will be considered enslaved. That's when the whole family left. That's when they moved to the frontiers of Western Pennsylvania to preserve their family. And so that being part of the history, still continues as far as this the divisions as far as race in families and communities. And I see that very clearly in her experience, as well as how folks function still within the haven that is the Black community, but also at the edge of concern and violence and threat. And at the same time, recognizing that the person that you may fear may also be related to you, just a few generations back. So racism comes into everything. And well, and even thinking about my father's side of the family, where I've got folks who are like, who would say things to me like, one of my titis, when I was considering graduate school, she was like, oh, you need to go to Miami. And I was talking about going to graduate school, but she said, you need to go to Miami and find yourself a nice Cuban to marry, because there's too much Black in the family. All these Leon men, they marry Black women. And because, of course, as Puerto Ricans, we're not Black. Like, even though we blackity black. And there's also like this tradition of resistance, even in birth certificates, of like claiming Indigenous ancestry, claiming our Blackness within baptismal records when many folks were denying. But this this push to like whiten the race by marrying outside, and it's like, but you do know the history of Cuba, right? Like you do understand that that's not gonna be it.
Yeah.
But yes, racism can be clear even in the family dynamic at a dinner table, let alone in academia.
So thank you. Wow. Yeah, there's so many layers, right? And there's so many layers. Before I'm going to answer this question, but before I do, I also want to kind of circle back to what you were talking about, Mary, in terms of, I think you were alluding to like the pods or the questions of the pods with the work that you write. And so I think we need to make sure that we address that, because I think that's an important piece in a conversation. So can you talk a little bit more about the actual work that you've been doing and using that and the dialogue you've been having about that?
Yeah, I'd love to hear from you both too, kind of your take on how this is all coming about and what we might do. I think Amina, reading your piece about how this time is not distance learning, we should think about this time as collective learning. And within that piece you speak to to looking to Black women who have really important ideas about how we need to think about this time and what we can do in that that moment. Reading your piece made me think about, okay, with the teacher education students, how can together we look at the moment and the movement that we're in. And so we read your piece, and we read, I mentioned Erica Turner's piece. We read a piece by Bettina Love called We Can't Go Back to the Way Things Were. And we read, what was the other one we read? A piece by Lisa Kelly, which is about, she says, reaching instead of distance learning. So remote emergency education for community health. And so I think just, like starting there and really think about like, okay, what are these, like, let's step back and think about, what is this whole time that we're in mean for how we can radically dream schools differently in ways that are just and anti-racist and anti-oppressive. And so, yeah, coming down to the whole, thing about like pods and the kinds of individual decisions families are making, like, I like my read so far from what I've learned is that like, it's really terrible that like we don't have a bigger system-wide approach to make schooling happen. I mean, in ways that are empowering and liberatory and really support everyone's basic human needs right now and protect people, you know, from the virus, from dying, especially, you know, communities of color. And so it's putting all these it's putting individual people in really, you know, unfathomably difficult positions of trying to figure out how to navigate the time, you know. So I guess I'll leave it there and jump in more. But I'd like to hear from you too.
Yeah, no, that I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, Raina. But let me answer the question about my family, and then I'll kind of connect it to the pod concern or question as well, and also the description of that piece. That thank you for mentioning it. So essentially, what I started doing was recognizing that the voices of people like mine and my family members, and because my family, you know, my mom and my dad were both, you know, college educated. My mom has multiple master's degrees. My dad had a doctorate degree, but they both came from like working class families who did not, you know, for the most part, go to college. So my dad went to, you know, he grew up in the segregated South. His family had in Texas, Southwest in Texas, but it was segregated, and he attended like a one-room school, and his mom sent him, like, you know, they had enough money to send him to college, but my dad's father, Johnny White, actually worked for Buick Motor Company as a janitor. And then he started a general store. And then when my dad was a boy, like maybe 9 years old, he had a heart attack in front of my father. My father was in the car, and so there's a society that came about called the Masons, the Freemasons, and it comes from sort of like this tradition. White Masons have like these secret societies that were built out of Christianity, but there was as a result of like the African Methodist Episcopal Church, there was a group of Masons that, you know, and they still exist, and they basically were a secret group of Black men, and they had a sisters group that was Eastern Stars. So my grandfather was a Mason, and my grandmother taught my father like some of the secret movements that they could do to show distress. So my father was like on the side of the road doing these distress signals, trying to, you know, these secret Mason signals, trying to get people to help him and his father, who, you know, because they were in this town in Texas called Greenville, Texas, which had a sign that said, "The blackest land and the whitest people." And you couldn't get medical attention in the hospital if you were Black at that time. This is in the early 1940s. So my father was born in 1933. So so probably like 1942, his dad dies in front of him. And then fast forward to 2016, my father becomes Muslim. He is in his 80s. He's like this. You couldn't tell, you know how they say Black don't crack, like that's very true of like my parents. And my dad was like in his 80s, and he like traveled, he left the country, he went on Umrah, he was just like clicking on all cylinders, right? And he leaves, he comes back, he's in LAX, and he slips and falls down the escalator, suffers a major brain injury. And like when they took pictures of him, and he looks like the escalator, like, you know, scraped up his back. It looks like he was like whipped with like enslavement. Like that was how it was, just a very traumatic experience for him to go through. And he didn't know where he was. So he calls my brother to pick him up from Oakland airport and tells him he's in San Francisco. Like, he doesn't know he's still in LA, right? And the EMTs just basically say, oh, this person denied medical attention. Very similar to like what happened to my grandfather, happens to my dad in 2016. They put my dad on a plane. He flies back to, Oakland, gets picked up, goes to Kaiser, has a CT, and they say his brain is bleeding. And my dad deteriorated over the course of a year to the point where he was, pretty much lost a lot of his ability to communicate. And like the story of his dad, I found that out because he really, I guess what part of what happens when the brain goes through these extensive traumas like this is that, it taps into probably memories that were suppressed, right? So he's able to kind of share some of these memories that I never knew. Like, my brother knew because my brother lived with my dad when he was in high school. So my dad shared certain stories with him that he, that I didn't know. So I never knew that, like, how my grandfather died and stuff like that until 2016. But when I found that story out, it was also when my own dad was dying, right? And so dad died in June 2017, and flash forward to 2020, and then we have this incident where George Floyd, like, I see George Floyd die, you know what I mean? At the hands of, and it just triggers, it doesn't trigger immediately until I wrote this piece called, I think might be a piece that one of you referenced about the Wonder Twin powers, the allies, right? So I think, Mary, you were referencing that piece. That piece was the first time I actually wrote down this generational trauma, like my dad's dad, to me, right? And the impact of that on me in my bloodstream. Like, and I didn't know, you know what I mean, until I wrote it down. And then after I wrote it, I couldn't even, like, I wrote it and then I posted it and then I didn't read it again because it was so painful. It's just a painful thing. It's just a painful, traumatic thing to know and to recognize that this is, this is what this country, brings for us. And so part of what I've been trying to do is just really get these stories out there, because I'm like, people don't know stuff like this, right? That this is still happening, that, 2016, like, you could still have, these terrible things, incidences that occur. And so I started interviewing my family. So, okay, I'm just going to start like these unhidden voices, and I'm just going to start talking to family members. And literally every single person that I talked to has had a negative interaction with the police, and even down to like my kids' generation. And, and my generation is, a lot of us are talking about like how ways we could protect. But the problem is that you can't, like, there's no way, because it's a systematized problem and it's bigger than us, right? It's so much bigger. So like the work that we're doing here, I think, is about sort of helping to at least bring people to the understanding that it is a problem. Because even like I had a conversation, like episode 8 is me trying to convince my cousin that him being arrested and handcuffed by the police is a result of racism, right? Because he was like, oh, it wasn't a negative interaction. And he was basically saying that he thinks that majority of the people who have interactions with the police, the reason why it escalates is because they're defiant, right? And I don't agree with that at all. But there's so then this recent incident that happened in, I think it was Colorado, where the woman was, she was in the parking lot. She was trying to get her nails done with her, like, her her nieces and her daughters and like her sister, and like there's like a car full of these women, and then the police pull them over and pull them out the car, guns drawn, and tell them lay on the ground, you know. And she's like, what are we, why, you know, why are you, we didn't do anything wrong. And I see this image of like this little girl who's like 6 years old with like a tiara on her head. And, you know, the police, these men are standing over her with guns ablaze. And it triggers a memory that I have of being a child in Los Angeles. And I was in a car with my mother, I mean, not my mother, my father, my uncle, and my siblings. And my dad drove the wrong way down a one-way street. And when by the time he makes the U to come back the right way, our car is surrounded by like 5 cop cars. They pull us all out. They handcuffed us all. I was handcuffed with my hands behind my back in front of Carl's Jr. in Los Angeles. And then I was arrested. And I was taken to jail. And my sister and I were placed in separate cells where we could talk to each other, right? My brother, because he was a boy, was placed in juvenile on the opposite side of the jail. And my dad and my uncle were placed in adult jail, right? We were in that jail begging them to let our brother at least come and be with us. And they refused until my cousin came to get us in the wee hours of the night. And my dad had to spend 2 days in jail before they dropped the charges against him, right? So I don't even remember how old I was. But the fact of the matter is, I wasn't being defiant. You know what I'm saying? It was just racism. And that's how I think it, you know, it impacts you in such a way that like it's generational, it's traumatic, it informs like every aspect of our lives, because we've been like, when we think like something can trigger something else. So like me seeing this baby girl in the, you know, brought me back to a memory of myself having that experience, a similar experience. Of having like these men standing over me, you know, and handcuffing me. And I know what it's like to be handcuffed because of that. I know what it's like to ride in the back of a police car because of that. I know what it's like to be behind bars because of that.